Hey guys, tonight, we're opening a door that probably hasn't creaked in centuries. You're standing in a room you didn't expect to find. Its walls are lined with dark wooden shelves, bowing under the weight of yellowed scrolls, brittle atlases, and maps that never quite made sense. A candle flickers to your left, not because you're imagining it, but because there's genuinely no electricity here. The air smells like dust and ink, and forgotten arguments between scholars. You haven't even unrolled the first scroll yet, and already something feels off. Tonight, you're not crossing oceans or decoding temples. You're following ruins, whispers, and symbols left by people who walked away or who never had the chance. Civilizations that built entire worlds, then vanished quietly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know what city or town are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in the heat. Not sweltering, just steady, the kind that makes the earth glow and the skin remember. The ground is flat, cracked, sun-baked. The horizon ripples. You hear wind, nothing else. And then, as if the silence had shape, you see them bricks. Not one or two, but entire walls. A staircase that leads to nowhere. Foundations of homes arranged in crisp geometric precision. You haven't stepped into a ruin. You've stepped into something impossibly modern, except it was built nearly 5,000 years ago. This is the Indus Valley. No one alive knows what the people here called themselves. Harappan Indus. These are names we gave them like nicknames for a stranger we're trying to remember. But they weren't vague. They were exact. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had street grids straighter than most modern suburbs. Their drainage systems ran beneath the roads connected to homes with bathrooms and covered sewers. Their bricks were uniformly sized. Their tools were standardized. Their weights accurate to the gram. Their architecture functional, efficient, elegant. And their language, we don't know. That's the strange part. We found thousands of small seals etched with symbols that repeat, structured, consistent, deliberate. But we haven't cracked the code. No Rosetta Stone, no bilingual key. Just clean lines in ancient clay. It's like listening to someone hum a brilliant tune behind a locked door. What's even more baffling is how quietly they seem to govern. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley leaves behind no statues of kings, no temples crowned with idols, no towering monuments screaming conquest. There's no evidence of armies, no palatial complexes, no imperial edicts etched into stone. If there were rulers, they must have been modest, or decentralized, or somehow irrelevant. Some scholars suggest a kind of egalitarian system, perhaps city-states, connected by shared culture but not centralized control. A cooperative network rather than a pyramid of power. But we can't be sure. The Indus left us order, but not identity. At its height, this civilization covered more area than Mesopotamia or Egypt. Millions may have lived here in cities with reservoirs, marketplaces, and the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro, a massive public tank lined with waterproof brick. Was it for ritual cleansing, civic gatherings, secret ceremonies under the stars? No one knows. But the engineering is precise. It didn't happen by accident. And then, around 1900 BCE, the exhale begins. The cities don't fall to war. There's no great fire, no invading force leaving a path of destruction. Instead, the signs point to a slow unraveling. Streets go quiet. Trade dwindles. Symbols vanish. The hum of urban life fades into silence. One theory blames the rivers. The once mighty Sarasvati, now little more than a memory, may have changed course or dried up altogether. When water leaves, people follow. Others suggest tectonic activity reshaped the land, or that shifting monsoons disrupted agriculture. Some point to salinization, too much irrigation, making the soil too salty to sustain crops. It may have been all of these overlapping like quiet catastrophes, a slow-motion collapse barely perceptible until it was too late. But not everyone's convinced by the natural explanations. There's the mystery of the script, how it appears suddenly remains consistent, then vanishes. Not gradually, abruptly. Did their language evolve into something else absorbed by later cultures? Or was it lost because the people themselves were lost? Then there are the skeletons. In certain parts of Mohenjo-Daro, bodies were found lying in the streets, arms outstretched as if struck down mid-motion. For a while, this fueled theories of mass violence or plague, maybe even atomic destruction, if you ask the fringe theorists who like to stir the pot. But closer analysis casts doubt. The bones may not be from the city's peak. The positions may mean nothing. Still, the image lingers. A peaceful, water-wise civilization. Undone. And then there's the bath again. The way it sits, intentional, ritualistic quiet. You wonder if this place was about more than cleanliness. Maybe the people who built it believed in renewal, in spiritual balance, in a kind of sacred rhythm that modern life has long since forgotten. We found their jewelry carnelian beads etched with care, their toys wheeled animals for children to pull along sunlit courtyards, their weights and measures balanced to perfection, but not their stories, not their songs, not their names. Some researchers now turn to artificial intelligence, hoping that machine learning can decode the signs on those ancient seals. But for now, the symbols remain stubborn, the civilization silent. And perhaps that's the point. Maybe their greatest achievement wasn't what they built, but how well they hid. Maybe the Indus Valley wasn't trying to leave a legacy carved in stone. Maybe they knew that some things are meant to dissolve into the earth and be found again only when someone is quiet enough to listen. You stand among their ghost grid cities. The wind picks up rushing through ruins that were once full of life, full of purpose. You imagine someone 4,000 years ago pouring water into that bath, adjusting the flow of a covered drain, watching the sun slide along a shadow line on their perfectly straight street. And then they were gone. No goodbye. Just the sound of air moving between bricks and the sense that something very old is still watching just beyond the veil of dust. You travel westward across time and miles to a place that once pulsed with life near the muddy banks of the Mississippi River. You wouldn't know it now, not at first glance. Today, it's just a grassy mound, a hill that seems too symmetrical, too deliberate. The grass ripples with the breeze, and from a distance it might look like nothing more than an odd rise in the landscape. But if you listen carefully beneath that green, the earth remembers something monumental. Welcome to Cahokia. It was the largest city in North America before European contact, bigger than London in the 12th century, with perhaps as many as 20,000 inhabitants at its peak. A sprawling urban center built not by invading empires or kings with armies, but by Native Americans whose names we no longer know. They lived in a complex, thriving civilization, complete with marketplaces, plazas, and even a kind of city planning. And right at the center of it all, Monk's Mound. It's the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas, rising nearly 100 feet high, with a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. You could have seen it glowing under moonlight 1,000 years ago, surrounded by hundreds of smaller mounds arranged in a careful celestial pattern. Cahokia wasn't just built, it was aligned. Its creators shaped the city in relation to the sun, the stars, and the seasons. Archaeologists uncovered wooden post circles dubbed woodhenges, used to track solstices and equinoxes. These weren't random decorations. They were calendars carved into earth, and sky helping priests and farmers synchronize their lives with the universe. And if you're picturing a sleepy collection of huts, forget that. Cahokia had neighborhoods. It had social classes, artisans, long-distance trade. Shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, and obsidian from the Rockies made their way here. This was no isolated outpost. It was a hub in a vast and vibrant web of exchange. And then, like a bonfire that flared too hot too fast, it dimmed. By the 1300s, the population had plummeted. The city was nearly empty. No invading army. No sweeping disease, at least none that left a clear mark. Just silence. Some scholars say overpopulation may have stressed the land. Others blame climate shifts, particularly the Little Ice Age, or the deforestation caused by building so many mounds and structures. There's even evidence of massive floods along the Mississippi, which could have swallowed farms and food stores whole. Still, for a place so vast, so ordered, and so spiritual, it left shockingly few stories. No written language, no epic carved in stone, no detailed oral traditions that survived. It's as if the people of Cahokia had placed their trust not in parchment or poetry, but in the earth itself, mounds that would endure longer than words. Imagine standing on Monk's Mound at dawn, mist curling off the river, looking down at the central plaza that once held sacred fires and ritual games. You can almost hear drums, faint rhythmic, echoing across the centuries. You can see families weaving baskets, traders arriving from distant lands, priests measuring the sun's position through tall red cedar poles. And then you blink and it's gone. What's left is stunning, but hollow. There's evidence of human sacrifice, of elite burials, with elaborate grave goods, thousands of shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird. Some mounds contain bodies that were violently killed, possibly captives or ritual offerings. It suggests hierarchy, power, belief systems we'll never fully comprehend. But for all we've found, Cahokia is a story we mostly have to imagine. And maybe that's the hardest part, because this wasn't a minor culture tucked away in some forgotten corner. This was a city that could have become a great capital of a continent. And yet, when Europeans arrived centuries later, no one even remembered its name. Its story had already turned to soil. Some say the people dispersed and became ancestors of tribes like the Osage or the Natchez. But ask those descendants today, and even they will tell you that the full truth is fogged by time. Cahokia teaches you something subtle but profound, that a civilization's disappearance doesn't always come from fire or conquest. Sometimes it just slips away unmarked by tragedy, but marked by forgetting. You stand now in the tall grass where homes once stood. The wind brushes your skin, and somewhere deep beneath your feet are bones, beads, shards of pottery dreams. And if you lean in close enough, you might hear something soft and almost too quiet to believe. They were here. They were magnificent, and they left no farewell. You head south now, deeper into the heart of Mesoamerica, where the jungle never quite sits still. The vines shift, the trees lean in, and beneath their green curtain, something stirs, a shadow of colossal heads and broken altars. It feels older than the forest itself, and in many ways, it is. You've arrived in the land of the Olmecs. If you were to stumble upon one of their stone heads in the wild, and many have, you'd be stunned first by the size. These aren't statues, they're monuments, each carved from basalt, each weighing up to 50 tons, and each wearing an expression that seems caught between command and contemplation. The helmets they wear suggest warriors, or perhaps ball players. The lips are full, the noses broad, the eyes watching. There are 17 of these colossal heads discovered so far, scattered across Veracruz and Tabasco in present-day Mexico. They weren't dragged into place for decoration. They were messages, icons, anchors to a forgotten worldview. The Olmecs are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, not because they were the first necessarily, but because they seem to have planted seeds that later civilizations would cultivate. You can trace echoes of their influence in the Maya, the Zapotec, the Aztec, calendar systems, writing, ball games. Even the concept of the zero may have roots here in a culture that flourished as early as 1500 BCE. And yet, we know so little about them. No Olmec manuscript has survived. their language still undeciphered, their true name lost. Olmec is a Nahuatl word meaning rubber people given long after they were gone, like naming ghosts after the scent they leave behind. What we do know comes from stones and shards. We've found jade figurines carved with uncanny finesse, suggesting a deep spiritual connection with animals, especially the jaguar, often portrayed with human features. Scholars call it the were-jaguar, a creature both man and beast, snarling and serene. What did it mean? A god, a myth, a vision seen in a trance? Historians still argue whether it symbolized rain fertility, shamanic transformation, or something else entirely. Olmec cities were built near rivers on artificial platforms, sometimes even above marshland. Places like San Lorenzo and La Venta weren't just ceremonial, they were engineered landscapes. Straight roads, massive stone thrones, burial mounds aligned with stars, and always the basalt heads. How did they move such stones without the wheel? That question alone has launched dozens of theories, from rolling logs to rafts floated on floodwaters. Some even suggest they were moved using sound resonance-based levitation. That one lives on the fringe, of course, but even the mainstream explanations leave much to wonder. La Venta, one of their major centers, featured a 110-foot-tall pyramid made entirely of earth and clay. It's one of the oldest pyramids in the Americas. From its top, priests or rulers could watch the sunrise align with sculpted altars below. The site's orientation matches precise astronomical angles, clear evidence that the heavens guided the hands that shaped the earth. But then, just as their influence began to spread, the Olmecs receded. By around 400 BCE, their cities were abandoned. The colossal heads stopped appearing. The culture that gave Mesoamerica its architectural and religious DNA faded into the background. Was it environmental collapse? Soil depletion from over-farming river systems shifting away? Some suggest internal strife, competing elites battling for power until the system unraveled. Others point to external pressure from emerging cultures who may have inherited more than they erased. Still, it's strange how neatly they vanish, as if they were never meant to linger. Perhaps the Olmecs weren't interested in permanence. Their art seems more concerned with transformation than legacy. Half-human figures, fluid forms, faces caught in moments of change, none of it screams conquest. It whispers mystery. And then, there's the elephant in the jungle. Those who claim the heads show African features, and that the Olmecs may have had contact with distant lands. Mainstream historians dismiss this, pointing instead to regional genetic diversity. But the debate persists, fueled by the faces carved in stone so lifelike, yet so anonymous. You walk now among the remnants. The air smells like damp stone and memory. The jungle encroaches, but the heads remain unblinking. Their gaze isn't angry. It isn't sad. It's something else. It's as if they knew you'd be here one day, that someone would find them, brush off the vines, and ask the same questions they've been silently waiting to answer. And perhaps they already have, not in words, but in presence. A culture that rose from rivers and vanished like mist, but left behind a row of stone faces still holding their breath. You're still in the desert, but the sand changes color. What was once humid jungle and humid myth has dried into wind-chiseled stone, a place where the cliffs themselves seem to keep secrets. You walk through a narrow gorge sandstone, towering above you on either side, and emerge into a world that shouldn't be here. Buildings carved directly into the rock, grand facades with columns, steps, intricate ornamentation, all hollow, empty, as if the mountain itself had been sculpted from within. You've arrived in Petra, the jewel of the Nabatean civilization. By day, it glows pink and gold in the desert light. By night, the stars hang above it like forgotten torches. It doesn't just feel ancient, it feels suspended outside of time. But before Petra became an Instagram pilgrimage or a movie backdrop, it was the heart of a desert empire. The Nabateans, Arabian traders turned architects, created this improbable city more than 2,000 years ago, tucked into the sandstone cliffs of what is now southern Jordan. And they didn't just build it, they engineered it. These were not wandering nomads. These were hydrologists, artists, linguists, economists. And yet, they left us almost no written history. We know them mostly through the structures they left behind and the silence they wrapped around themselves. The Nabateans mastered the impossible life in one of the most arid regions on Earth. They carved cisterns, canals, and dams into the rock, collecting flash floodwaters in reservoirs and controlling it like desert alchemists. In a place that sees almost no rain, they made water abundant, growing gardens, creating fountains, even supplying public baths. It was water that made Petra possible. It was water that made the Nabateans rich. And rich they were. Their empire stretched from the Sinai to Damascus. They controlled vital trade routes, acting as middlemen for goods from Arabia, India, and the Silk Road. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, silk all passed through Nabatean hands. They levied taxes, minted their own coins, and maintained a flexible diplomatic presence with surrounding empires, including the Romans. Their wealth poured into Petra. The famous treasury Al-Khazne is only the beginning. Dozens of tombs, temples, and homes spiral out through the cliffs. Unlike most ancient cities, Petra isn't built up. It's carved in. A negative space civilization cut from absence, not presence. And here's the twist. Petra was a necropolis as much as it was a metropolis. The facades we see today were mostly tombs. The living city lay deeper in lower down and more vulnerable to decay. The grandeur we visit now was in many cases built to honor the dead. Why did they spend so much energy decorating death? Maybe it was spiritual, maybe political, maybe aesthetic. Historians still argue whether the Nabateans believed the rock itself held power, or if carving into it was a form of taming it. Either way, they made permanence out of impermanence. But the silence wasn't just architectural. The Nabateans never left behind a comprehensive text. They spoke and wrote in a mix of Aramaic, Arabic, and Greek, but what survives are inscriptions, brief, formulaic. No grand epics, no history scrolls, no Nabatean version of Herodotus. This was a people who thrived on flexibility. They absorbed elements from surrounding cultures, religions, art styles, alphabets, and blended them with their own. Polytheistic temples sat beside structures later converted into churches. Egyptian, Assyrian, Hellenistic, and Roman influences swirl through Petra's columns and statues. And then, in the early 2nd century, CE, Rome arrived. At first, it was diplomatic, then political, then formal. In 106 CE, the Roman Empire annexed Nabatea and folded it into the province of Arabia Petraea. For a while, Petra flourished under Roman rule, new roads, theaters, even more trade. But slowly, quietly, it declined. Trade routes shifted. The sea became more important than the land. The incense caravans faded. Earthquakes damaged infrastructure. And when Islam rose in the 7th century, Petra's spiritual and economic relevance waned even further. By the time Europeans rediscovered the city in the 19th century, it was abandoned. Locals knew it. Of course, it was never entirely lost. But to outsiders, it appeared like a mirage, a full-blown city carved into desert stone. Its builders unknown, their voices absent. And that absence has made Petra a magnet for projection. Some say the Nabateans were descendants of the Edomites. Others claim they were a splinter of ancient Hebrews. There are even fringe theories connecting them to Atlantis or biblical tribes. But perhaps the truth is simpler and stranger. The Nabateans were masters of survival through invisibility. They didn't build monuments to their leaders. They didn't write manifestos. They didn't announce themselves with conquest. They thrived by knowing when to adapt and when to disappear. And in doing so, they left behind a city that now whispers more than it ever shouted. You sit in the shadow of the treasury, as the last light fades from the sky. The silence isn't empty, it's sacred. The wind moves through the Syke Canyon behind you, like a breath from centuries past. Somewhere nearby, water still drips through a stone-cut aqueduct just as it did when the Nabateans walked these paths. And for a moment, you wonder if they're still here, not as ghosts, but as architects of absence, masters of mystery, builders who knew that some cities should outlive the civilizations that made them. You're walking north now, following trade routes and memory through the sun-burned plains of Anatolia. The wind carries dust and fragments of language, none of which you can quite decipher. It's a place that feels layered, as if time never fully discarded its earlier drafts. Ahead, stone walls rise from the grass in irregular rows, not majestic anymore, but heavy, weighty, serious. There's no flourish to them, just presence. You've stepped into the world of the Hittites, before the Greeks, before the Romans. Even before the Israelites chronicled their struggles in Canaan, there were the Hittites, a people who built an empire and then vanished so thoroughly that for centuries scholars weren't sure they ever existed at all. And yet they did. Their capital was Hattusa, tucked in central Turkey, ringed by fortifications so massive and enduring that they still cast long shadows today. The Lion Gate, the King's Gate, stone carvings that feel almost too stylized to be real, as if ancient Game of Thrones concept art had been burned into limestone. At their height, the Hittites were one of the great powers of the late Bronze Age rivals to Egypt, Mycenae, and Assyria. They controlled a vast territory stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates. They fought Ramses II at the Battle of Kadesh. They signed what many historians consider the world's first surviving peace treaty. And still we forgot them. For nearly 3,000 years, they were reduced to a footnote until excavations in the early 20th century uncovered their archives, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets written in Hittite and other languages of the era. Suddenly, an empire emerged from the dust. Their writing was adapted from Mesopotamian script, but their language entirely unique. Indo-European, but with odd twists and turns that make even seasoned linguists pause. It's the oldest known written Indo-European language, and the tablets they left behind, a treasure trove of treaties laws, religious texts, and political correspondence. These weren't mindless warriors. They were scribes, diplomats, engineers, farmers. The Hittites worshipped a pantheon of thousands of gods, a divine bureaucracy to match their administrative one. Temples dotted their cities. Rituals were complex, seasonal, cosmic. Their priests kept calendars. Their kings acted as intermediaries between gods and mortals. And yet in all that order something cracks. Around 1200 BCE, the Hittite Empire collapses. Cities are abandoned. Writing stops. Stone walls crumble. The great imperial machine simply ceases. Why? The Bronze Age collapse. That almost mythic moment in history when empires across the eastern Mediterranean fell like dominoes. Mycenae, Ugarit, the Kassites. Even mighty Egypt barely held on. Some historians blame a combination of natural disasters, earthquakes, droughts, crop failures. Others cite the mysterious sea peoples, marauding forces that appear in Egyptian records, but nowhere else. There's talk of systems collapse, too much complexity, too little flexibility. A house of cards built too tall. For the Hittites, the collapse was total. Even their capital Hattusa was burned. And then silence. For centuries, no oral traditions survived in the cultures that followed. No continuous lineage of kings. No Hittite descendants demanding remembrance. Just buried cities and unreadable scripts until archaeologists finally uncovered them. And even now their story feels incomplete. Why did a civilization so literate, so expansive, so interconnected vanish so completely? Historians still argue whether they were wiped out externally or unraveled from within. Maybe both. You walk along the crumbled perimeter of Hattusa. You imagine the sounds of horses, soldiers, prayers, scribes scratching symbols into clay. You picture a world held together by language and ritual, stretching across mountains and rivers, and then one day gone. Not just the people, but the memory. Until we dug them up. You pass through the Lion Gate. The carved beasts are eroded now, but still watching. Behind them, a once orderly city now only speaks in whispers. And in those whispers, you hear the question echo again. How can something so mighty disappear so fully? And more importantly, how many others have done the same? You descend again, this time to an island bathed in sun breeze and mystery. The sea surrounds you like time itself, pressing gently from every side. Olive trees twist their limbs toward the sky, and white stones poke through the earth like ancient bones. You're on Crete now, where echoes of bull dancers and labyrinths still cling to the air. This is the land of the Minoans. Long before Athens and Sparta, before democracy and hoplites and marble philosophers, the Minoans built something different, something graceful. Their world wasn't defined by walls and wars, but by frescoes and flowing lines. They didn't carve their names into stone for glory. They painted dolphins on the walls. The center of their world was Knossos, a sprawling palace complex unlike anything else in the Bronze Age. No fortress, no battlements. Instead, open courtyards, complex plumbing, light wells color everywhere. It wasn't just a seat of power, it was a statement, an invitation. And the colors are what hit you first. Reds, blues, ochres, images of people with fluid limbs and expressive eyes, leaping bulls gathering saffron dancing. Everywhere you turn, life spills from the walls, not in rigid military scenes, but in motion, celebration, and ritual. The Minoans were among the first in Europe to develop writing, first in a hieroglyphic form, and then in something called Linear A. We still can't read it. Unlike the later Greek Linear B, which was eventually deciphered, Linear A remains one of the great linguistic mysteries. Historians still argue whether it was related to Greek at all, or if it belonged to a completely separate language family now extinct. Their religion, too, feels dreamlike. No pantheon carved in solemn granite. Instead, they worshipped in caves, hilltops, and courtyards. Their central figure may have been a mother goddess, flanked by snakes, flanked by doves. Fertility, nature, power. You won't find rigid dogma here, but symbols woven into everyday life. A fluid kind of faith. And then there's the labyrinth, the myth of the Minotaur, born from a bull and hidden in a maze beneath the palace of Knossos. It's tempting to dismiss it as Greek invention, but you stand in Knossos, and the corridors really do twist. The palace layout is sprawling, non-symmetrical, almost alive. If you were a child here, it wouldn't take much imagination to believe in a monster waiting around the next corner. Was there a bull cult? Almost certainly. Bull imagery is everywhere on seals, frescoes, pottery. The famous bull leaping scenes show acrobats vaulting over horned beasts in impossible arcs. Sport, ritual. Both no one agrees, but the symbolism is undeniable: strength, transformation, control over chaos. The Minoans weren't isolated. Far from it. They traded widely. Egyptian scarabs have been found in Crete, as have Syrian artifacts, Baltic amber, and Anatolian tin. Their ships cut across the Aegean like whispers. They were both islanders and influencers, and then one day it began to fall apart. Many point to Thera, modern-day Santorini, where a massive volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE may have unleashed destruction across the region. Ash blanketed the skies. Tidal waves may have battered the Cretan coast. Trade routes fractured. Some say this was the moment the Minoans began to wane, but not everyone agrees. Knossos remained occupied after the eruption. In fact, some of the finest art comes from the post-Thera era. Others suggest an eventual Mycenaean invasion, mainland Greeks, absorbing Minoan culture even as they replaced it. Linear B which records early Greek, shows up in Crete not long after. It could be that the Minoans didn't fall all at once, but faded. Their culture diluted their language, replaced their identity, slowly folded into someone else's story. And yet their fingerprints linger. The idea of beauty as power, the reverence for nature, the open palace, the painted walls. You stand in a corridor cracked with age and imagine the sun streaming through a light well, warming the painted dolphins. Somewhere, a lyre plays. Somewhere, a woman in a tiered skirt adjusts a bowl of olives. Somewhere, a bull stamps its foot. You've never heard their words, but their story moves anyway, in color, in curve, in quiet. And that may be the most Minoan legacy of all. You're high up now, higher than you expected. The air is thin and crisp, and the wind carries stories it doesn't want to let go of. You're not in the jungle or the desert anymore. You're in the sandstone cliffs of the American Southwest, staring at dwellings tucked neatly into the face of a canyon wall. You've arrived among the ancestral Puebloans, once called the Anasazi, though that name is slowly falling out of favor. Here, the past doesn't stand in towers or pyramids. It clings to rock embedded in cliffside alcoves, stacked stone upon stone, like a secret carefully folded and hidden in plain sight. You take in the massive complex's multi-story interconnected rooms, kivas sunken into the earth, for ceremony ladders leaning into openings like half-finished thoughts. The most famous sites, Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde, the great houses of Chaco Canyon, don't just impress, they confuse. How did people living in such remote, arid lands construct something so enduring, so intricate? Start with Chaco. Between 850 and 1250 CE, Chaco Canyon in modern-day New Mexico became a center of culture, astronomy, and architecture. Roads radiated outward straight lines carved into the desert, often ignoring terrain. These were not paths of least resistance. They were symbolic routes, possibly pilgrimage lines, spiritual corridors across the landscape. The buildings, too, speak a language we barely understand. Great houses like Pueblo Bonito weren't just homes. They were hubs, perhaps ceremonial, political, or astronomical. The masonry is precise. Stones fitted together like puzzle pieces, walls curved just so to follow the arc of the sun. Some doorways align with solstices. Light streams through them only on specific days of the year. In one small chamber, a spiral petroglyph catches a sliver of sunlight exactly at noon on the summer solstice. It's not a calendar, it's a sermon in shadow. And yet, for all their planning, their system frayed. By the late 1200s, many cliff dwellings were abandoned. Chaco had already been mostly deserted. Mesa Verde followed. Whole communities packed up and moved on. Why? Historians still argue whether it was prolonged drought, resource depletion, or social upheaval. Evidence suggests all of the above. Tree ring data shows a persistent drought in the 1100s. Corn harvests would have failed. Water sources would have shrunk. At the same time, there's archaeological evidence of violence, defensive structures, burned dwellings, perhaps even cannibalism, though that's controversial and heavily debated. What's strange is how total the shift was. These weren't gradual fade-outs. These were decisive departures. Entire cliff cities emptied, great houses left to the wind, but the people didn't vanish. Their descendants still live among the Hopi, the Zuni, and other Pueblo peoples of the Southwest. They tell stories of migration, of emergence, of great journeys across the land, guided by signs, stars, and spirits. And those stories aren't metaphor, they're memory. Oral history carrying the weight of stone. The term Anasazi, often used in the past, means ancient enemies or ancestors of enemies in Navajo. Understandably, many modern Puebloans reject it. They prefer Ancestral Puebloans, a name that connects rather than separates, that sees continuity rather than just ruins. You kneel inside a kiva, a circular ceremonial room dug into the earth, and imagine a fire flickering in the center. A group sits in quiet prayer stories, curling into the rafters like smoke. Outside, sandstone cliffs turn orange in the setting sun. Below, the canyon breathes. There's something profoundly human here, this need to build upward while staying rooted. To live in communion with the land while trying to reach the stars. Unlike other ancient civilizations, the ancestral Puebloans didn't build to dominate. They built to harmonize. Their architecture follows the land, not defies it. Their cities hide rather than flaunt. And perhaps that's why they feel so mysterious. Not because they're lost, but because they're still whispering, and we've only just learned to listen. The ground beneath your feet changes again. Richer, now blacker, more loamy. You're in Eastern Europe, but not the Europe you know. There are no castles, no Roman ruins, no medieval cathedrals, just vast fertile land that once pulsed with fire clay and memory. You've entered the world of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture. It's a mouthful, yes, but also one of the most intriguing Neolithic civilizations you've likely never heard of. Between roughly 4800 and 3000 BCE, this culture flourished in what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania. Long before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before written language, they were building something astonishing, and then burning it all down. Literally, the Cucuteni Tripilians built enormous settlements, some of the largest in the ancient world for their time. Places like Talianki and Maidanetsky, with populations in the thousands, laid out in concentric circles or spiraling patterns that suggest careful, deliberate planning. These weren't scattered villages. These were proto-cities. The houses made of clay and wood, often 2 stories covered in vibrant red, black, and white painted designs, swirls, diamonds, labyrinths. Inside, you'd find clay ovens, looms, even tiny furniture figurines that show people knew how to live well. The walls were decorated, the floors smoothed. These were homes built for comfort and ceremony. And then, after a few generations, they'd burn them, not from invasion, not from accident. It was intentional. Entire settlements, hundreds of houses burned to the ground in controlled fires, over and over again for centuries. Why? That's one of the great mysteries. Some believe it was a ritual of renewal tied to a cyclical worldview, life, death, rebirth through flame. Others suggest practical reasons, rebuilding on top of the ruins to create more stable foundations. Still, historians and archaeologists continue to debate it. Whatever the reason, fire was sacred here. Destruction wasn't an end, it was a passage. And they weren't just builders and burners. Their pottery is among the finest in Neolithic Europe, spiraling patterns that seem hypnotic, almost mathematical. You hold a shard in your hand, and it feels both ancient and startlingly modern. Some designs even resemble fractals long before the concept existed. The level of detail suggests not only skill, but an aesthetic worldview, a society where art wasn't decoration, but identity. Then there are the figurines, hundreds of them. Female figures with exaggerated hips, almond eyes, and confident stances. Scholars interpret them as goddesses, priestesses, fertility icons. Or maybe they were just portraits. Maybe the women who ran these households also ran the show. Because here's the thing, there's almost no evidence of warfare. No fortified walls, no weapons of conquest, no mass graves. For a culture that spanned more than 1,000 years and built some of the largest settlements in prehistoric Europe, that's remarkable. It suggests something almost utopian: egalitarian communities, with a strong role for women, ritualized destruction instead of violent collapse, and art embedded into daily life. And then, they disappeared. Around 3000 BCE, the settlements were abandoned. The fires went out. The pottery stopped. Some believe they were absorbed or displaced by incoming Indo-European groups, the Yamna culture pastoralists from the steppes. Others point to climate change or resource exhaustion. But again, the end is quiet. No conquest, no catastrophe, just the soft erasure of time. Modern archaeologists have only recently begun to appreciate the scale of the Cucuteni Tripilia achievement. Their sites were hidden under farmland for centuries. Their legacy is still being pieced together from charred walls and painted clay. And the biggest question lingers: how could such a complex, peaceful society, possibly matriarchal, almost certainly artistic, definitely organized, be so thoroughly forgotten? Maybe because they didn't leave behind great stone monuments. Maybe because they weren't warlike. Or maybe because the cultures that followed had different values, louder ones. But you sit now beside the imprint of a clay oven, the earth still slightly blackened with ancient ash, and you wonder what it felt like the moment the fire was lit, not to destroy, but to renew. A farewell, not of fear, but of purpose. You breathe in and it's faint, but you swear you can still smell the smoke. The jungle is dense here, thick with heat mist and echoes. Every leaf seems to drip. Every tree root curls like it's hiding something. And beneath this green, suffocating blanket, entire cities sleep. You're in the southern lowlands of Mesoamerica now, in the land of the Maya, not the tourist brochures, not the sanitized myths. This is deep time. 1,000 years of architecture, astronomy, and collapse, all wrapped in vines. When most people think of the Maya, they think of the classic period from about 250 to 900 CE. That's when the jungle teemed with cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, and Copan. Each was its own kingdom, with its own ruler, its own emblem glyph, and its own sacred duties to the gods. And make no mistake, this was not some primitive society. These were city-states with palaces, pyramids, observatories, writing systems, libraries carved in stone. Yes, libraries. The Maya left behind thousands of inscriptions. Some were calendrical, some historical, some religious. And though many were destroyed by Spanish invaders, enough remained to tell us this: they remembered everything. They recorded eclipses, battles, royal births, and ritual events to a level of detail that would make any modern historian blush. They tracked time in overlapping cycles, solar calendars, lunar calendars, sacred 260-day counts, and the famous long count, which predicted the end of the world in 2012, or didn't, depending on your interpretation. Their math included zero-something even the Greeks never quite embraced. Their pyramids were aligned to solstices, equinoxes, and planetary movements. At Chichen Itza, the shadow of a serpent slithers down the temple of Kukulkan twice a year, its tail wiggling in sunlight. This wasn't coincidence, this was design. And yet, for all this brilliance, the cities of the southern lowlands fell into silence. Not all at once, but over a couple centuries, beginning in the 8th century, CE major sites were gradually abandoned. Temples were no longer built. Stele inscriptions stopped. Royal tombs became rarer. Eventually, the jungle swallowed them whole. Why? Oh, where to begin? Historians still argue whether the collapse was caused by environmental degradation, deforestation, soil depletion, drought, or by political instability, warfare between rival cities, or revolts by common people pushed past their limits. Some point to climate data showing prolonged droughts. Others highlight increased fortifications and signs of civil war. The truth, probably all of the above. A perfect storm of ecological pressure and social fracture. A civilization so carefully tuned to cycles of time may have failed to recognize the danger of its own excess. And yet again, we must clarify, the Maya didn't disappear. Their descendants still live throughout Mesoamerica, in Guatemala, Belize, Mexico, and Honduras. They still speak Maya languages. They still farm the land, celebrate the old gods alongside the new, and carry stories older than stone. What ended was the urban world of the classic Maya, the towering city-states of the southern lowlands. In the north, places like Chichen Itza and Mayapan continued to thrive for centuries longer. The collapse was regional, not absolute, but the jungle did its part. It grew over palaces, temples, causeways. It broke lintels, pushed stones apart. And so, for many years, explorers stumbled upon cities with no names, no living memory to anchor them. Only now, with LiDAR technology laser scanning from planes and satellites, are we beginning to grasp the true scale of the Maya world. Hidden under dense forest canopy are thousands of previously unknown structures, pyramids, homes, terraces, roads. It turns out what we thought were scattered cities might have been part of an even larger interconnected web, and we're still uncovering it. You walk now through the ruins of Tikal at dawn. Howler monkeys bark in the distance. The mist rolls across stone plazas, once crowded with priests, dancers, scribes, and kings. You pass a stela, a vertical stone monument covered in glyphs. You can't read it, not fully. But you feel the rhythm, the echo of events once so urgent they were carved into time. A few toucans clatter in the canopy above you, and you wonder how many stories are still waiting beneath your feet. How many questions have moss for answers? And how close did we come to forgetting it all? The sky opens up here, not with sunlight, but with wind. Endless, salted wind. You're on a remote speck in the vast Pacific, and even before you see them, you feel the statues watching you. Silent, massive, unblinking. Welcome to Rapa Nui. You probably know it as Easter Island. And yes, it's remote. One of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, more than 2,000 miles from South America, over 1,000 from the nearest inhabited island. A place so alone, it feels like the edge of the world. And yet, people came here, thrived here, carved a legacy into volcanic rock so boldly that it still stuns visitors centuries later. The Rapa Nui people arrived sometime between 800 and 1200 CE, likely from Polynesia, though the precise routes remain debated. Imagine that journey navigating by stars' currents and seabird patterns, crossing an ocean with no land in sight for weeks. And upon arrival, a treeless island, wild and windy, but alive. They built a complex society, chiefdoms, clans, and sacred places called Ahu, lining the coast. But it's the Moai that define this place, enormous statues, many over 30 feet tall, carved from volcanic tuff, placed on platforms facing inland, their backs to the sea. Not gods, ancestors, guardians, watching over the living. And they weren't just heads though, that's the myth. Most Moai have bodies torso length, some even with arms folded across their bellies. Some wore pukao cylindrical topknots made from red stone weighing several tons. Think of them as stylized hair or ceremonial headdresses. They weren't placed randomly either. Every platform had astronomical significance. Every statue had a lineage. And here's where the mystery deepens. How did they move them? Theories abound. Logs used as rollers, sledges pulled by ropes. Or this one's catching on, they walked the statues upright, rocking them forward in a coordinated shimmy, using ropes and teams on either side. There's even experimental archaeology that demonstrates this might have worked. Imagine a 30-ton stone figure waddling like a penguin across the island. History has a sense of humor. The real surprise, the island had no wheels, no large beasts of burden, and yet nearly 900 Moai were carved and transported, some over 10 miles. That's commitment. But the story of Rapa Nui isn't just about ingenuity, it's also about collapse. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the island's society was fractured. Many Moai were toppled, pushed face down, possibly during internal conflicts. The lush forests that once covered the island were gone. Without trees, boats couldn't be built. Birds disappeared, soil eroded, food sources dwindled. What happened? The old theory was ecocide, self-inflicted destruction. The people in their obsession with building statues over-harvested resources until the ecosystem collapsed. Palm trees cut down, rats possibly introduced. A civilization that quite literally deforested itself into disaster. But modern archaeologists suggest a more nuanced story. Yes, deforestation occurred, but possibly slowly with deliberate management. And yes, internal conflict likely played a role. But so did European contact slave raids in the 1800s, devastated the population. Missionaries outlawed native religion. Disease followed. By the late 19th century, only a few hundred Rapa Nui people remained. It wasn't a single moment of collapse. It was a series of blows, each weakening the thread until it snapped. And yet the culture endures. Rapa Nui people still live on the island. They still speak the language. They still tell the stories, care for the Moai, and fight for cultural preservation. The statues weren't abandoned. They were protected. And maybe that's the true heart of Rapa Nui, not a cautionary tale of hubris, but a story of resilience. You stand beneath a row of Moai at Ahu Tongariki. The wind roars from the ocean behind you. The sky is bruised with cloud. One by one, the statues cast their long shadows inland, as if scanning the landscape, still watching for something, still waiting. You look into their stone-carved eyes, those that once held white coral and obsidian pupils, and you swear they're not watching you. They're watching for someone to remember, someone to carry their story back across the ocean, someone to whisper their names. And maybe tonight that someone is you. The Mediterranean breeze returns now, but this time it's laced with bronze and shadow. You're standing on rocky hills, olive groves at your feet, and far in the distance, the Aegean shimmers. This is Greece, but not the Greece of marble statues and democratic debates. No philosophers, no playwrights, no Spartans or Athenians. This is older, wilder. Welcome to Mycenae. Between 1600 and 1100 BCE, the Mycenaeans ruled these lands, and not from quiet temples, but from fortresses. Hilltop citadels encircled by cyclopean walls, so massive that later, Greeks thought only giants could have built them. You're standing now beneath the Lion Gate, the emblem of ancient power, in a city that once commanded armies, navies, and myths. You might recognize the names: Agamemnon, Menelaus, Helen, Achilles. Homer sang their deeds centuries after they'd passed, weaving history into legend. But peel back the poetry, and there's something very real behind the epic. The Mycenaeans were warriors and kings, yes, but also bureaucrats. Their cities were administrative hubs, filled with storerooms, workshops, and tablet archives written in Linear B, the earliest form of Greek we can actually read. These weren't scribbles. They were inventories, records of grain oil, livestock, weapons. This was a civilization that counted everything, and what they built wasn't just functional, it was symbolic. Tombs shaped like beehives called tholoi sunk deep into the earth. The treasury of Atreus so massive and mathematically precise that it remained the largest dome in the world for over 1,000 years. Their palaces had frescoes, courtyards, and even rudimentary plumbing. Not crude barbarians, but organizers of immense complexity. Their reach extended far. Mycenaean pottery has been found from Egypt to Italy. They didn't just raid, they traded. They adopted aspects of Minoan culture after taking over Crete, merging it into their own brand of militarized elegance. And yet, like others in the late Bronze Age, they fell. Around 1200 BCE, the system shattered. Cities burned, palaces were abandoned, trade networks collapsed. And again, the reasons remain frustratingly unclear. Was it external invasion, internal revolt, earthquakes, drought? Possibly all of them. The Sea Peoples strike again in scholarly debates. One theory even suggests a cascading collapse. When one part of the international system failed, the rest quickly followed, like pulling a single thread and unraveling the whole garment. But for the Mycenaeans, the fall was not just structural, it was cultural. Their script, Linear B, vanished. For 400 years after the collapse, there's no evidence of writing in Greece, a literal dark age. Oral stories filled the void, tales that would become Homeric epics, passed down until they were eventually written centuries later. And in that myth-making, the Mycenaeans transformed from historical rulers to legendary heroes. You look around now at the ruins of the citadel. The walls still stand massive, imposing, pitted with age. Below in the dry grass are shaft graves, deep vertical tombs, where golden masks once covered the faces of the dead. One, they say, belonged to Agamemnon. Probably not, but it doesn't matter. Because the Mycenaeans understood something vital: memory is power. To be remembered, even inaccurately, is better than being forgotten. They carved their legacy in stone, in gold, in stories sung beside fires long after the palaces crumbled. And perhaps that's what sets them apart. They didn't vanish silently. They lingered in Homer's verses, in Greek DNA, in the very word Mycenaean, which still evokes a world of kings, warriors, and windswept shores. You walk the length of a fallen wall, the sun hot on your back. The silence feels familiar now, not empty, but earned. The Mycenaeans fell, yes, but in a way, they never left. The sun is higher, now hotter. You feel the shift not just in temperature, but in time. You're leaving the world of myth and bronze and stepping into the highlands of East Africa, where a different kind of empire once rose. One that forged coins, carved stele, and sent its ships down the Red Sea. This is Aksum, the empire that Africa remembers even if the rest of the world too often forgets. The Aksumite Empire flourished between the 1st and 7th centuries CE in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. You're standing near its capital, not far from modern-day Aksum, where massive stone obelisks, some over 70 feet tall, still pierce the sky. They're carved from single pieces of granite, decorated with false windows and doors, as if to imitate multi-story buildings. Some have fallen broken in earthquakes or ancient conflicts. Others still stand stubborn and regal. They mark royal tombs, these stelae. They weren't just monuments, they were announcements. We are here. We are mighty. We endure. And for a long time they did. The Aksumites were builders, traders, and navigators. They minted their own coins, gold, silver, and bronze, stamped with inscriptions in Ge'ez, their script and language. Some bore Christian crosses. Others featured crescent moons. And unlike many ancient empires, their coinage wasn't just for internal use. It circulated widely, found as far away as India and Byzantium. You begin to trace the trade routes in your mind. Aksum was ideally placed straddling inland African resources and maritime access through the Red Sea. Frankincense, ivory, spices, gold, slaves. Ships sailed from the port of Adulis, heading north toward Egypt, Arabia, and beyond. In fact, the 3rd century Roman historian Mani once named Aksum one of the world's 4 great powers, alongside Rome, China, and Persia. Not bad for an empire so few modern textbooks even mention. And while many ancient civilizations resisted outside beliefs, Aksum embraced them, at least selectively. Around the 4th century CE, King Ezana converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the first major empires in the world to officially adopt the faith. Churches followed, as did new iconography. The cross replaced older pagan symbols. But it wasn't a wholesale cultural replacement. Aksum's Christianity retained unique local elements, rituals, saints, architecture, all deeply Ethiopian. And here's where the story twists. Despite their power and prominence, Aksum slowly faded from global memory. The reasons, complicated. One theory suggests climate change played a role, shifting monsoons, and declining rainfall reduced agricultural productivity. Another points to the rise of Islam and the Arab caliphates, which changed trade dynamics in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. Suddenly, Aksum's maritime importance declined. Ports like Adulis fell into disuse. Some suggest internal strife, overexpansion, or even disease. The capital was eventually moved to the highlands, and the monumental stele era ended. The written record grows thinner. What remains are echoes. But here's the thing, Aksum didn't vanish into nothing. It evolved. The Christian kingdom persisted in the Ethiopian highlands, cut off from the rest of Christendom by Islamic territories, but enduring all the same. Its monasteries guarded ancient texts, its churches remained active, and its people remembered. To this day, Ethiopia practices one of the oldest forms of Christianity in the world, directly descended from the faith first adopted under King Ezana. You walk now beneath a broken stele, its surface etched with the wear of wind and centuries. You imagine the labor it took to carve, to raise, to believe in something so permanent. And as you touch the warm granite, you realize this isn't a ruin. It's a milestone, one that marks not just what was lost, but what was carried forward. Aksum didn't fall. It stepped back, quietly enduring where it could in ways that stone can't always show. In a world obsessed with explosions and collapses, Aksum offers something else, the slow, defiant grace of survival. The wind changes direction again, drier, now sharper. You find yourself moving southward from Aksum's highlands toward the edge of the Arabian Peninsula. The air tastes of frankincense and salt, and a reddish haze clings to the distant mountains. This is Yemen, not the Yemen of modern headlines, but a land once rich in incense, spice, and legend. This is the kingdom of Himyar. It's not as well known as its neighbors, not as glorified as Aksum, or as ancient as Sumer. But in the early centuries, CE Himyar was a powerhouse, a trade empire, with influence stretching from Mecca to the sea. And you can still feel the bones of it here. Fortresses high in the hills, temples crumbling in the valleys, a patchwork of inscriptions in the ancient South Arabian script, precise, angled, stubborn against erosion. They speak of kings and gods, wars and alliances. Some speak in praise, others in warning. Himyar rose in the wake of older South Arabian kingdoms like Saba and Qataban. By around 110 BCE, the Himyarites were consolidating power-shifting trade routes and carving out a new identity. Their base was the southern highlands, a more defensible terrain, and one closer to the vital incense-producing trees of the Hadramaut region, frankincense and myrrh. These were more than fragrances. They were global commodities, burned in temples from Rome to India, used in medicine ritual and burial. Himyar controlled the source and the roots. Caravans crossed the desert under their watch. Ports welcomed ships bound for Africa, Persia, and beyond. But Himyar was more than trade. It was also a place of shifting beliefs. Early on, the Himyarites followed traditional South Arabian polytheism gods like Almaka and Athtar, linked to the moon war and rain. But around the 4th century CE, something changed. Judaism took root, not in the form of exiles or scattered converts, but as an official state religion. Kings embraced it. Inscriptions changed. Temples were replaced with synagogues. Some scholars debate how this conversion happened, whether through cultural contact with Jewish communities in the region, or through political motivations to resist Christian influence from Aksum and Rome. But by the late 4th or early 5th century, Himyar had become a Jewish kingdom, a rarity in the ancient world. And that's where the trouble begins. Across the Red Sea, Aksum had by then fully embraced Christianity. Tensions rose. Trade became entangled in theology. Around 523 CE, under King Du Nuwas, the Himyarite state launched a violent crackdown against Christians in the region, particularly in the city of Najran. Sources, especially later, Christian ones, describe a brutal massacre, martyrdom, fire, blood in the sands. Whether or not the scale was as dramatic as claimed, the political fallout was enormous. Aksum responded swiftly. With Byzantine support, they invaded Himyar, toppling Du Nuwas and installing a Christian ruler. Some accounts say Du Nuwas rode his horse into the sea rather than be captured. And just like that, Himyar's independence was over. But its story doesn't quite end there. Over the following decades, the region became a tug of war between Aksum, the Sasanian Persians, and local Arab tribes. When Islam emerged in the 7th century, it spread quickly through these fractured lands. The old gods were long gone. Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism had jostled for influence. But Islam offered something different: unity. And with that, the memory of Himyar began to fade. Today, most of its ruins lie unexcavated. Political instability in Yemen makes archaeology difficult, but what we do know suggests a kingdom that was sophisticated, multicultural, and deeply entangled in the currents of world history. You run your fingers along a stone inscription, worn but still sharp, its letters defying time. It's in a script older than Arabic, a voice from a world few remember. And you wonder how many more of these stories lie beneath the dust, waiting for peace, waiting for someone to listen. Himyar may be quiet now, but the incense still burns somewhere. And the wind, if you listen closely, still carries whispers from the red hills. You cross a sea now, a shallow one, sunlit and warm. On the western coast of Italy, tucked between forested hills and volcanic lakes, you find yourself in the shadow of a culture that once rivaled Rome, and may have taught it how to be Roman in the first place. Welcome to the world of the Etruscans. Before Caesar, before the Senate, before SPQR banners hung from marble buildings, there were the Etruscans. From roughly 900 to 300 BCE, they thrived in central Italy, particularly in what is now Tuscany, Umbria, and parts of Lazio. Even the name Tuscany carries their memory. You arrive at an acropolis, yes, a city of the dead, but one that feels very much alive. Tombs shaped like huts, or houses clustered like neighborhoods. Inside, vibrant frescoes, banquets, dancers, musicians, feasts of wine and laughter. It's not somber, it's joyful. The Etruscans didn't fear death. They invited it to the table, and what a table it must have been. This was a culture obsessed with refinement. Their pottery was exquisite, their metalwork delicate, their clothing, jewelry, and even shoes were admired and imitated by their Greek neighbors. They built roads, bridges, and walled cities. Their ships roamed the Mediterranean. They were among the first to cultivate wine on the Italian peninsula, and they were urban long before Rome was anything but a muddy village. Archaeologists believe the Etruscans heavily influenced Roman religion, architecture, engineering, and even social rituals. The toga, Etruscan. Gladiatorial games, possibly Etruscan funerary rites. The Roman alphabet adapted from the Etruscans, who had borrowed it from the Greeks. But for all this cultural richness, the Etruscans remain mysterious. We still don't fully understand their language. While we can sound it out thanks to its Greek-derived script, we don't have a complete Rosetta Stone. Many inscriptions are funerary or votive, short, formulaic, frustratingly vague. What we do know, however, is that they were organized into city-states like Tarquinia Veii and Cerveteri. Each city had its own king or council. They cooperated at times, especially when facing external threats, but often quarreled among themselves. Sound familiar? Rome absorbed them slowly, but not passively. Some Etruscan kings even ruled Rome in its earliest days. The most famous Tarquinius Superbus was Rome's last king before the Republic was born. His ousting marked a turning point in Roman history and a slow erasure of Etruscan identity. By the time Rome truly began its imperial expansion, the Etruscans were already fading, culturally absorbed, politically outmaneuvered. Their language fell silent. Their gods were renamed, their stories rewritten by the victors, and yet again the stones remember. You walk through Tarquinia's painted tombs, where leaping dolphins, swirling vines, and reclining couples dance across the walls. There's a sense of ease here, of life well lived, not in service of empire or conquest, but of balance. Art, pleasure, ritual, reverence. The Romans inherited the land, yes, but the Etruscans gave it soul. Historians still argue whether they came from Anatolia, the Alps, or were native to Italy all along. Genetic studies offer conflicting clues. Some myths claim they arrived by sea, led by the son of a Trojan hero. Others say they rose from the earth itself. Maybe both are true in a way, because the Etruscans understood something elemental, that identity isn't static. It's woven from threads, some local, some distant, all overlapping. You leave the necropolis with that thought lingering. They didn't build colosseums or write epics, but they built homes for the dead that still make us feel alive. They didn't conquer the world, but they shaped the one that would. And sometimes being first doesn't mean being remembered. It means being absorbed so deeply that your voice echoes through someone else's. The coast shifts again westward now toward a part of Spain that feels like a dream carved in gold. You're standing on the edge of the Iberian Peninsula, where the Atlantic sighs and the Guadalquivir River snakes quietly inland. Beneath your feet is legend. Perhaps Atlantis. Perhaps just a whisper of it. You've entered the forgotten world of the Tartessians. Few ancient civilizations straddle the line between history and myth, quite like Tartessos. Mentioned by Greek writers like Herodotus and strung across Phoenician trade routes, Tartessos was said to be fabulously rich, overflowing with silver, tin, and gold. A kingdom of abundance, culture, and mystery. And yet, what do we really know? Not nearly enough. The Tartessians emerged sometime around the 9th century BCE and flourished for several hundred years in what is now southwestern Spain, especially around the modern region of Andalusia. They built settlements along rivers, traded with the Phoenicians, and mined the mineral-rich mountains of the Iberian interior. You kneel beside a smooth piece of bronze, once part of a sculpture, now oxidized green and forgotten. This was a culture that worked metal like poetry. Tartessian craftsmanship blended native Iberian styles with Near Eastern flair. Jewelry, weapons, ceremonial items, all of it spoke of wealth and cosmopolitan contact. They left behind enigmatic artifacts, including the so-called Tartessian warrior statues, hulking helmeted figures with circular shields standing like ancient sentinels. Some call them gods. Some call them ancestors, some call them puzzles. Even their language remains a mystery. Inscriptions in the Southwest script, also called Tartessian, dot the landscape etched into stele and funerary markers. Though written in a script loosely based on the Phoenician alphabet, the underlying language is undeciphered. It may be Indo-European, or not. It may be Celtic, or not. It may be entirely its own thing, a voice from the deep well of pre-Roman Iberia. And then, silence. By the 6th century BCE, the Tartessians vanish from the written record. Some scholars suggest they were destroyed or absorbed by the Carthaginians after a conflict over trade dominance. Others argue for natural disaster, an earthquake perhaps, or a tsunami sweeping through the lowlands. And still others link Tartessos with the myth of Atlantis. It's tempting. Plato describes Atlantis as a wealthy seafaring civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. Tartessos fits the bill, advanced, coastal, mysterious, and gone. The marshy lands around the Doñana National Park near the ancient Tartessian heartland even resemble descriptions of concentric canals and ringed islands. But myths don't prove history, and history at its softest becomes myth. What remains are questions and a few tantalizing clues, like the treasure of El Carambolo, discovered in 1958 near Seville. It's a hoard of golden jewelry and artifacts, necklaces, bracelets, and plaques, stunning in their artistry. Some claim it's purely Phoenician. Others insist it's Tartessian with Eastern influence. Either way, it proves one thing: these people lived well. And not just materially. Their urban planning, their sacred spaces, their integration of native and foreign elements all suggest a culture that thrived on hybridity. Tartessos wasn't isolated. It was a crossroads, a place where Atlantic Europe met the Mediterranean, where myth met trade. You walk now along a marshy path where reeds brush against your ankles. The air hums with insects, warm and still. Somewhere beneath this soil may lie the remains of a capital city once described as shining with metal and music. But the earth keeps its secrets, and the Tartessians, like so many others, recede into the fog. Not entirely gone, just quiet. Their legacy embedded in the soil, in the coins of Carthage, in the myths of Plato, in the songs sung by Spanish fishermen who don't even realize they're echoing ancient names. Sometimes the most powerful civilizations aren't the ones who conquered. They're the ones who shimmer, briefly dazzle, then disappear, leaving just enough behind to haunt the edges of certainty. The hills around you rise steeply now, terraced with ancient stones dotted with wildflowers and goats that move like they've memorized the cliffs. You're in the region the Greeks once called Lycia, where land meets sea in a landscape of rugged defiance. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear a different kind of silence, one that was once filled with voices no longer spoken. This is the lost world of the Lycians. They were not the most famous of peoples, nor the most powerful, but they were distinct, independent. And despite pressure from empires that rose and fell all around them, Persians, Greeks, Romans, they carved out a culture uniquely their own. Lycia sat in what is now southwestern Turkey, nestled between the jagged Taurus Mountains and the turquoise Mediterranean. A land of ports and peaks, it was naturally protected, hard to conquer, and harder still to assimilate. The Lycians liked it that way. Even the Greeks, notorious for labeling others as barbarians, spoke of them with a kind of grudging admiration. They had their own language, their own customs, and most notably, their own form of government. This is what sets them apart: Lycian democracy. Centuries before Athens held its first vote, the Lycians had developed a confederation of city-states, an early form of federalism. Each city sent representatives to a regional council based in Xanthos, the capital. The number of votes each city had was based on its size and importance, a surprisingly modern system for the 6th century BCE. And the Lycians had style too. You climb now into the cliffs, and there they are, rock-cut tombs carved directly into the mountain faces, shaped like houses and temples, some as high as 4 stories. The most famous is the tomb of Amyntas, whose columns and pediment mimic classical architecture, but were carved into living stone around 350 BCE. These weren't tombs of anonymity. They were bold, visible, and individual, a declaration of presence even in death. Their sarcophagi are just as striking. Massive stone coffins placed high above ground, their lids shaped like boat hulls or curved arches. Each one carried inscriptions, sometimes names, sometimes curses against thieves or desecrators. They believed in memory, they believed in warning, and they believed in watching over the living. But the Lycians were not isolationists. Their art shows influence from the Greeks, Persians, and Hittites. Their coins bear inscriptions in both Lycian and Greek. They adopted and adapted always on their terms. When Persia swept westward in the 6th century BCE, Lycia was absorbed into the empire, but not erased. They retained a measure of autonomy their confederation allowed to function, their culture left largely intact. When Alexander the Great arrived, the Lycians, pragmatic as ever, welcomed him. Better to align with power than fight it, and they knew how to survive. But slowly, under the weight of Hellenization and Romanization, their language faded. Their tombs were left unvisited. By the 3rd century, CE, Lycian had vanished, replaced by Greek in daily use. The last whispers of their native tongue lingered in a few scattered inscriptions until even those went silent. And so the Lycians disappeared, not in fire, not in conquest, but in absorption. Yet their uniqueness remains. You sit now beneath a stone sarcophagus, the shadow of its lid stretching long across the path. You remember the words of Herodotus, who noted that Lycians traced their descent not through the father, but the mother. A matrilineal society in a patriarchal world. Even in lineage, they walked their own path. And you wonder, what if more civilizations had done the same? Historians still argue whether their language was Indo-European or something older, whether their origins lie in the Sea Peoples or in Anatolian roots deeper than memory. But one thing is clear, they left behind something beautiful, a blueprint for balance, for federated cooperation, for defiant individuality nestled between empires. You breathe in the mountain air, the sea glimmers far below. The tombs gaze down like weathered sentinels, still watching the roads still present after thousands of years. The Lycians are gone, yes, but their voice, quiet, stubborn, and carved in stone, still echoes where the cliffs meet the sky. Now you find yourself climbing higher than before. The air thins. The earth changes color, drier, grayer, with flashes of green in cultivated terraces. You're in the Andes now, deep in South America, where civilizations have risen and fallen for thousands of years without ever touching the wider world. This is the domain of the Huarpa and Wari cultures. Before the Inca built their empire of stone and sky, others paved the way quietly, brilliantly. The Huarpa were among the first. By around 200 BCE, they settled in what is now south-central Peru. Modest perhaps by the standards of later empires, but sophisticated. You walk the outline of a small Huarpa settlement, low stone walls, circular buildings, irrigation canals, still faintly visible beneath tufts of highland grass. These people understood the land, its cycles, its dangers, its potential. They grew maize, potatoes, and quinoa. They built with adobe and stone. They used terraces and channels to tame the steep terrain. But the Huarpa didn't remain isolated. Around 500 CE, they began to change gradually, then profoundly. They evolved or were absorbed into something larger, the Wari. And here the story swells. The Wari, sometimes spelled Huari, weren't just a civilization. They were an early empire, perhaps South America's first. Between 600 and 1100 CE, they expanded through highland valleys, desert coasts, and tropical margins, controlling territory nearly as vast as the later Inca. Their capital, Wari, near modern-day Ayacucho, was a marvel-walled compounds, orderly streets, monumental buildings, and an intricate system of reservoirs and canals. It housed tens of thousands, one of the largest urban centers of its time in the Americas. The Wari didn't write, but they left stories in stone. You step into Piquilacta, another major Wari site. The name means flea town thanks to the tiny rooms that dot its 700-plus structures. But this was no mere village. It was a planned city, gridded streets, standardized housing, thick perimeter walls. Some think it functioned as an administrative hub. Others say it was a ceremonial center. And like all good mysteries, there's disagreement. Historians still argue whether the Wari governed as centralized overlords or loose federators, whether their expansion was military, religious, or economic. But what's clear is their influence, their architectural style, their agricultural techniques, even their methods of record-keeping. Some scholars believe the Wari developed a proto-quipu system using knotted cords to store information, a direct intellectual ancestor of the Inca, if true. Their religion too left marks. At Cerro Baul, you find a Wari outpost improbably perched atop a mountain ridge. Archaeologists believe elite rituals were held here, perhaps beer-fueled ceremonies involving chicha, a fermented maize drink. In fact, they've uncovered breweries, ceramic vessels, and the remains of burned feasting halls. When the site was abandoned, the Wari appeared to have destroyed it themselves, burning their own temples, smashing their own ceramics. A controlled exit, a symbolic farewell. And that's the strange thing, the Wari disappeared not in collapse, but in dispersion. By 1100 CE, the central state faded. Cities were abandoned. Regional centers dissolved. But unlike other fallen civilizations, the Wari didn't leave smoldering ruins behind. They left infrastructure ideas and techniques, many of which were adopted by the Inca centuries later. In this way, they're not just a lost civilization, they're a hidden foundation. You sit now on a stone terrace high above the valley. The wind whistles through the canyons, and the sky stretches wider than you've ever seen. A bird circles overhead, a condor maybe, and for a moment, time folds. Below you lies the ghost of empire, but not a dead one. The Wari taught others how to build in stone, how to govern diverse regions, how to think in altitude. Without them, the Inca might have remained a highland tribe instead of an empire of sun and silver. And the Wari, they may be silent now, but their fingerprints are everywhere, etched into mountain cities, carved into agricultural terraces, whispered in the bones of civilizations that followed. Some legacies don't scream, they guide. You're deep in the desert now, not the kind with shifting dunes, but the ancient kind. Flat, cracked plains stretching beneath a punishing sun. Wind rattles across empty rock fields. No trees, no rivers, just silence and sky. And then you see them, stones arranged in deliberate patterns, circles, alignments, a calendar made of shadows. Welcome to Nabta Playa. Long before the Egyptian pyramids, long before written history, humans gathered here in the Nubian desert of southern Egypt. This was once a seasonal lake, now dry and lifeless, but over 7,000 years ago, it was a lush basin fed by monsoons. Here among the cattle herders and nomads, something extraordinary took root. Nabta Playa is one of the oldest known ceremonial sites in the world, and it may contain the world's first astronomical observatory. You step into the center of the stone circle, a small, humble structure of sandstone slabs aligned with astonishing precision. At summer solstice, the sun rises directly between two of the standing stones, casting shadows that mark the longest day of the year. Some alignments even point to the star Sirius, which played a key role in ancient Egyptian calendrical systems. How did they know? That's the riddle. These were pre-literate pastoral people. No cities, no temples, just herds, huts, and sky. Yet they tracked celestial cycles with an accuracy that rivals later civilizations. Historians still argue whether this knowledge was purely practical, used for grazing schedules and water management, or deeply religious. And then there are the megaliths. Nearby lie larger monoliths, some standing, some toppled. They were transported from kilometers away across the desert, likely without wheels. Some slabs weigh multiple tons. Their arrangement suggests ritual spaces perhaps linked to fertility rites or ancestor worship. Archaeologists have uncovered buried hearths, ceremonial deposits, and even human remains surrounded by cattle bones. The cow wasn't just food here, it was sacred. Some scholars argue Nabta's cattle cult may have laid the foundation for later Egyptian religious iconography, including Hathor, the cow goddess of love and motherhood. You press your hand against one of the stones. It's warm, ancient, silent. But silence doesn't mean absence. There's a weight to this place, not just geological, but spiritual. You're standing in the imprint of something profound, something that refused to write its story down. It left no books, no temples, just stones and shadows. And yet the message lingers. As climates changed and the monsoons retreated, Nabta Playa was abandoned. The lake dried. The people moved northward, possibly toward the Nile Valley, where they may have mingled with early Egyptians. In this sense, Nabta isn't just a ruin. It's a parent, a primordial echo of ideas that would later shape one of the most enduring civilizations on Earth. You imagine a young boy here 6,000 years ago, watching the stars with his grandfather, marking the solstice with small pebbles, learning that the sky could guide, could teach, could warn. That boy's descendants may have built pyramids, and this desert, empty though it seems, still holds that memory. You sit on the ancient lakebed, now bone dry, and look up. The stars aren't visible yet, but you know they're there waiting, just as they were millennia ago. And somehow that's comforting. The wind now carries a salty chill. You've traveled down the western spine of South America, past towering Andes peaks and highland empires. But now you're stepping back farther deeper into something older. Before Machu Picchu, before the Wari, before writing, before wheels. Welcome to Norte Chico, one of the oldest known civilizations in the Americas. It doesn't look like much at first. A wide valley opens before you, brown and gold under the late-day sun. No great statues, no towering ziggurats, just strange mounds, dusty platforms, sunken plazas, and silence. But what you're standing in is a city, one of many. This is Caral, the crown jewel of the Norte Chico civilization, which flourished in coastal Peru between roughly 3500 and 1800 BCE, contemporary with the Old Kingdom of Egypt and long before the Maya or Inca. And here's the part that bends your mind: they built cities without ceramics, without metal tools, without weapons, without visible signs of war. What they did have was scale, organization, complexity. You descend into the Great Pyramid of Caral, a platform mound nearly 5 stories high, made of stone river cobbles and reed-filled baskets called shikras, used as load-bearing filler. Surrounding it are smaller pyramids, residential zones, and ceremonial plazas. It's laid out with a sense of symmetry of planning, and yet it's eerily quiet. No murals, no carvings, no faces staring back from the past. The Norte Chico people, sometimes referred to as the Caral Supe civilization, left no written language, no art in the traditional sense, no armies carved in relief, no gods in human form. So how do we know they were a civilization? By what they built and what they left behind. Their pyramids weren't tombs. They were temple centers of ritual and authority. Their economy was based not on agriculture alone, but also on marine resources. They fished the rich Pacific coast anchovies, sardines, shellfish, and brought the bounty inland. And most stunning of all, they had quipus. Yes, quipus. The knotted string devices later used by the Inca to record census data, taxes, and calendars. Some archaeologists believe the Norte Chico developed an early version of this system, making them the inventors of a unique, non-written form of record-keeping. No other early civilization, none relied so heavily on textiles over texts. You hold your breath as you descend into one of the sunken plazas. The acoustics are deliberate. If someone speaks at the center, the voice carries clearly to the rim. These weren't just gathering places, they were designed for oration, for ceremony, perhaps, for song. And they understood more than structure. Their buildings are aligned to astronomical features, the sun at solstices, certain stars, and planetary events. They watch the heavens like their contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia, not to worship them exactly, but to understand cycles, rain, drought, tide. Historians still argue how such a complex society functioned without warfare. There are no fortifications, no battle imagery, no mass graves of violence. Could it be that Norte Chico organized itself through ritual and trade through religion rather than force? Or have we simply not found the weapons yet? Either way, it's humbling. You walk through corridors that haven't echoed with footsteps in 4,000 years. You see irrigation canals, among the earliest in the Americas, used to draw water from the Supe River to support crops like cotton, squash beans, and guava. Cotton was vital. It allowed the weaving of fishing nets, clothing, and perhaps the very cords of the quipus. It became currency in itself, traded for fish between inland and coastal communities. And then, as if in a dream, it ended. By around 1800 BCE, the Norte Chico cities were abandoned. Why? Climate change, perhaps. The weakening of the El Niño cycle, reducing coastal productivity. Shifting trade patterns. Internal stress. We don't know. But the foundations they laid would echo for millennia. Later, Andean civilizations from Chavin to Moche to Inca would inherit their spatial logic, their cosmic calendars, their reverence for landscape. Even the concept of centralized planning seems to have its roots here. You stand again at the base of Caral's pyramid. The sun dips low, shadows stretch long, and you realize this is a place that reminds you just how much can be built without war, without conquest, without fanfare. A civilization not lost, but woven into the land. Softly, subtly, enduring, you hear them before you see them. Horns, drums, the rhythmic thunder of something vast moving across the sea. But it isn't real. Not anymore. Just memory. Just myth. You're standing at the edge of history, staring out into the eastern Mediterranean. The sun glints off the waves, and somewhere beyond the horizon lies the legend that has haunted archaeologists and generals alike. The Sea Peoples. We don't even know what they called themselves. Sea Peoples is a modern term, a placeholder really. A name given to a confederation of seafaring raiders, invaders, perhaps refugees, who surged into the eastern Mediterranean during the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE. What we do know is that they changed everything. This was a time when great empires ruled the known world: the Hittites in Anatolia, the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Egyptians along the Nile, and powerful city-states like Ugarit Troy and Byblos. And then, silence. Burned cities, broken walls, abandoned palaces. It all collapsed. And somewhere in that storm, the Sea Peoples arrived. You walk through the ruins of Ugarit, once a cosmopolitan port, now a skeleton of streets and half-buried tablets. It was destroyed suddenly, violently, around 1190 BCE. Letters found here, written in cuneiform, speak of ships on the horizon of threats from the sea. One king pleads for help. None came. Was it famine, earthquakes, political instability, or war? Historians still argue. But the Sea Peoples are always in the center of the debate. Egyptian records offer the most vivid images. Reliefs at the Temple of Medinet Habu, commissioned by Pharaoh Ramses III, depict chaotic naval battles. Warriors with feathered helmets, round shields, and strange swords clash with Egyptian forces in chariots and boats. The inscriptions name some of them: the Peliset, possibly the Philistines, the Cheker, the Shekelesh, the Denian, and the Weshesh. Some may have been displaced Indo-European tribes, others perhaps disgruntled mercenaries or economic migrants. Were they a unified invasion force or simply a desperate tide? Their origins remain uncertain. Some may have come from the Aegean, pushed out by volcanic eruptions or internal collapse. Others may have fled drought in the western Mediterranean. Still others could have been drawn to the riches of weakened cities, striking like vultures. But here's the thing: they didn't just destroy, they settled. Archaeological layers in coastal Canaan show a transition, not just a burn layer, but a rebirth. New pottery styles, new architecture, hybrid traditions. The Philistines, once feared as invaders, become farmers, artisans, and neighbors. And yet their story is told only through others. We have no Sea Peoples texts, no known inscriptions in their own hand, no epic poems, no origin myths. Just fragments, wreckage glimpsed through the eyes of their enemies. You wander now through a field in Cyprus. Beneath your feet may lie the remains of a war camp or a lost port. Some scholars believe the Sea Peoples used the island as a staging ground. Others think it was their home all along. A ceramic shard crunches underfoot, red and black spiraled, unfamiliar. The Sea Peoples weren't ghosts. They were human, hungry, moving, adapting. They came at a moment when the world was brittle, when cities were overstretched, when trade was fragile, when climate and politics were teetering. They didn't cause the collapse, they wrote it, and maybe in that chaos they forged something new. By 1000 BCE, most of the Sea Peoples vanish from the record, or rather, become part of it. Their identities absorbed into new kingdoms, new cultures. The Philistines flourish in the Levant. Others disappear into Phoenician harbors or inland valleys. You sit at the edge of a crumbling cliff. The sea murmurs below. Somewhere out there, a fleet once moved in silence. Wooden hulls, creaking sails taut with wind eyes, fixed on a shore that couldn't defend itself. And even now, no one knows exactly who they were. Just that they came, and the world was never the same again. Now you're crossing sand, but it doesn't feel like a desert. It feels alive. The dunes here are not endless. They ripple between ridges and valleys, carved with faint trails marked by the memory of wheels, long rusted, and bones long buried. This is the Fezzan region deep in the Sahara of southern Libya, a place you might think has always been empty, but buried beneath the sands lies a vanished kingdom that once pulsed with life. You've entered the world of the Garamantes. If the name sounds unfamiliar, you're not alone. For centuries, they were little more than a footnote in Roman texts portrayed as nomadic raiders, desert barbarians, who harassed the empire's southern frontier. But the truth is far more complex, and far more impressive, because the Garamantes weren't just wanderers. They built cities. You arrive at Jerma, their capital, or what's left of it. Dusty walls rise from the earth like the spine of a sleeping giant. Streets still visible, houses still outlined in stone, surrounded by what was once fertile land. Yes, fertile, because the Garamantes were engineers. They mastered the Sahara. Beneath your feet lies a vast system of underground tunnels known as fogaras, horizontal wells, that tapped fossil water from deep aquifers and channeled it drop by drop to the surface. Some of these qanats stretched for miles, dug entirely by hand, maintained for centuries. In a desert where rainfall was rare, the Garamantes turned the earth into an oasis, and their cities thrived. By the 1st century CE, the Garamantes had established urban centers with multi-story buildings, markets, workshops, and even cemeteries. They traded with Carthage, Rome, and sub-Saharan Africa, moving gold, ivory, slaves, and salt across brutal terrain via camel caravans. You can almost hear it now, the plodding hooves, the jangling harnesses, the hush of sand underfoot. But they weren't just middlemen. They were their own civilization. Their language remains undeciphered. Inscriptions in the ancient Tifinagh, script an ancestor of modern Berber writing, dot tombs and pottery shards. Their art, though rare, shows unique styles, geometric designs, stylized figures, and chariots always chariots. The Garamantes were expert charioteers. Roman sources speak of their fast-moving raids, their ability to vanish into the dunes. But those same sources also grudgingly admired their strength, resilience, and self-sufficiency. They were Rome's problem, but never Rome's possession. And that defiance may have come at a cost. By the 4th century CE, their cities began to shrink. The wells ran dry. The climate, already harsh, turned harsher still. Trade routes shifted. Rome's collapse rippled outward. And eventually, the Garamantes faded into the sand. But not completely. Satellite imagery in the 21st century revealed hundreds of lost settlements. Archaeologists have uncovered cemeteries with thousands of graves, evidence of social hierarchy, agricultural planning, long-distance trade. Historians still argue, were they a state-level society, a confederation of tribes, a desert empire? What's clear is this: the Sahara was never empty. It was once mapped with life. You kneel beside a ruined Fogara entrance. The air it exhales is cool, almost impossibly so. This tunnel, dug by hand over a millennium ago, still breathes. It's easy to romanticize civilizations that conquered oceans or carved mountains, but there's a different kind of brilliance in those who listened to the earth instead, who found life not in conquest, but in adaptation. The Garamantes didn't vanish in glory. They dissolved grain by grain, stone by stone, back into the landscape they once commanded. And you walk away quietly, not with pity, but with awe, because the desert remembers. And so do you. You awaken now in the half-light before sunrise, chilled by altitude and mystery. The soil is dark and volcanic beneath your feet, the air crisp and thin. Nothing stirs, nothing modern lingers. You've crossed time again, this time to a place that shouldn't exist at all. You're standing at the edge of Göbekli Tepe. High on a hill in southeastern Turkey. This isn't a city. It's not a village. It's not even a temple in the usual sense. It's something older, stranger. It predates pottery, predates agriculture. It may even predate myth. By 10,000 years, you walk slowly among the stone circles, massive T-shaped pillars arranged in careful rings, some weighing 10 to 20 tons, each carved with reliefs of animals: foxes, boars, vultures, snakes, lions. Some stand alone. Some lean slightly now, eroded by millennia, but still impossibly deliberate. This place dates to around 9600 BCE, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid. It rewrites the timeline of human history. Before Göbekli Tepe, we assumed people gathered into cities after learning to farm. But this site suggests the opposite, that belief may have come first. That ritual and community, and the urge to build something sacred, may have preceded bread. You imagine them now, small bands of hunter-gatherers, hauling these megaliths with ropes and willpower. No wheels, no metal tools, just vision. And the vision was consistent. The site wasn't built in a single moment. It evolved over centuries, perhaps millennia. Older circles were filled in with rubble, and new ones built atop them, as if every generation knew they were part of something deeper than memory. And then suddenly they buried it all. Yes, buried. Deliberately. Each ring of pillars entombed in its own dirt, preserved like a sacred fossil. Archaeologists believe the entire complex was intentionally hidden sometime after 8000 BCE. Not destroyed, not abandoned, covered, as if to protect it or hide it. Historians still argue what Göbekli Tepe was for. A temple, a seasonal gathering site, a social glue for scattered tribes. There are no tombs, no altars, no writing, just towering stone guardians staring across 10 millennia. You run your hand over one of the carved foxes. Its body is stylized, its proportions strange, but the energy feels immediate, alive. The same animals still roam these hills, but no one carves them like this anymore. No one has to, and maybe that's the point. Göbekli Tepe sits on a fault line between memory and myth, between survival and imagination. It challenges our assumptions. It asks whether our ancestors were driven not only by hunger, but by meaning. Were these people builders of worlds, or simply wanderers trying to understand the sky? A nearby excavation trench reveals another layer, and beneath that, another. Researchers believe as little as 5% of the site has been unearthed. The hill might contain dozens more rings, more secrets, more glyphs lost in stone. And the best part, they're still digging. Each season, a little more light shines into the past. Each year, a new carving, a new pillar. And each time it seems the story gets stranger. You watch the sun rise now, casting long shadows between the stones. There are no voices, no offerings, but the silence feels full, not empty, as if the land itself is humming. And you understand something simple, something ancient. Even before cities, we built circles. To gather, to witness, to remember. You step away slowly, the sky warming behind you. And Göbekli Tepe remains, unwritten, unexplained, but never forgotten. The highlands fade now, and you descend into thinner air, into the crisp chill of the Bolivian Altiplano, 13,000 feet above sea level. The wind is sharp, the sun glaring, and every breath feels a little too shallow. But the silence here has a different weight. Not absence, not abandonment. Something like awe. You've arrived at Tiwanaku. What was once a sacred capital is now a puzzle of stones scattered across the plains. Doorways that go nowhere, walls with no roofs, a monolith cracked like an eggshell. But don't be fooled, this place is not a ruin of confusion. It's a statement from a vanished people who knew exactly what they were doing. Tiwanaku, or Tiahuanaco, depending on who's writing, was the heart of one of the most influential pre-Inca civilizations in the Andes. Its people thrived from around 400 to 1000 CE, yet their origin is far older, and their influence stretched far beyond these windswept fields. You pass through the Kalasasaya, a sacred precinct defined by megalithic slabs arranged with startling precision. This wasn't just a temple, it was a calendar in stone. The eastern and western corners align with the sunrise on equinoxes and solstices. Time here was carved into architecture, and then you see it. The Gateway of the Sun, 10 feet high, 13 wide, carved from a single block of andesite. At its top, the staff god stands, part human, part deity, flanked by winged attendants, rays radiating from his head. Scholars still debate the meaning. Some see a solar calendar, others see mythological scenes. But what's certain is that this image reappears throughout Andean iconography, even in distant Wari and Inca artifacts. Tiwanaku's reach was vast, not through conquest, but culture. Their ceramics, textiles, and architectural styles spread across modern Bolivia, southern Peru, and northern Chile. Unlike the later Inca, the Tiwanaku built more through influence than force. They mastered agriculture in a brutal environment. Step down into the remains of Suca-Collis raised field systems, engineered to absorb and retain heat-protecting crops from nightly frost. Channels between the mounds helped regulate water and even encouraged the growth of aquatic plants and fish. It wasn't just farming, it was symbiosis. Their people fed not only their capital, but vast hinterlands. Some estimates suggest Tiwanaku supported a population of 20,000 to 40,000 in the city itself, huge for its time and altitude. Some think it may have been even higher, including surrounding suburbs. Yet, despite this success, they didn't leave a written language, no chronicles, no recorded names of kings. We know them only through bones, walls, and shards. Historians still argue what Tiwanaku was: a religious pilgrimage site, a trade hub, a sacred capital. All three. The layout suggests central planning, ritual architecture, and a cosmology written into stone. But unlike the Inca, there's no firm evidence of military expansion. Then, sometime around 1000 CE, it began to fall apart. Why? Climate may be to blame. A prolonged drought devastated agriculture. With no rain, the Suca-Collis failed. Starvation followed. The elites lost legitimacy. The temples were abandoned. By the time the Inca rose centuries later, Tiwanaku was already a ruin. But not forgotten. The Inca revered it. They believed it was the birthplace of humanity, the place where the first people emerged from the earth, guided by Viracocha, the creator god. They sent pilgrims here, offered tributes. Even they didn't dare reshape it. You kneel now by a fallen stone head, one of many. They once lined the walls of the semi-subterranean temple, facing inward, each different, each carved with its own face. No two are the same. Scholars think they may represent ancestors, conquered peoples, or something even more abstract. The diversity of humanity united in ceremony. You can't help but stare back. The eyes are blank but not empty, and in that moment you feel seen. Tiwanaku didn't build empires of conquest. It didn't leave behind towering palaces or recorded wars. It built meaning, into stone, into land, into time. And though its voice is silent, its stones still speak if you're willing to listen. Now you drift across the steppes, dry cold, stretching into the edges of modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. The wind here doesn't whisper, it rasps. The soil crunches underfoot, powdered with dust from 1,000 forgotten roads. Traders once passed through here, soldiers too, and monks and merchants. This was a crossroads, a hinge in the great turning wheel of Asia. And here once stood the Sogdians. They didn't build pyramids, they didn't raise armies to rival Rome, but they moved ideas, languages, religions, and people. Their power wasn't carved in stone, it was etched into the folds of the Silk Road. You're walking now through the ruins of Panja, Kent, their best preserved city. You see faint walls, sunken courtyards, and rooms where merchants once weighed gold on bronze scales and debated prices in Sogdian Chinese Sanskrit or Greek. This wasn't just a city, it was a portal. The Sogdians thrived from roughly the 4th century BCE to the 8th century CE, particularly during the height of the Silk Road. Their homeland was centered in the Zarafshan River Valley, near the ancient cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. And while other cultures rose and fell through conquest, the Sogdians became essential through something quieter connection. They were the Silk Road's middlemen. Sogdian merchants ferried goods from China to Byzantium, silk, jade, spices, glass, ivory. But more importantly, they ferried stories. Religions passed through their hands: Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Manichaeism, Christianity, Islam. The Sogdians didn't just carry them, they translated, debated, adapted. Their written language, a variation of Aramaic, became the lingua franca of commerce along the route. Letters found in western China, dated to the early 4th century, reveal personal voices: a wife abandoned traders, warning of bandit attacks, a longing for home. You stop before a crumbling mural. Yes, mural. Because Sogdian art, though rare, is luminous. In Panjakent, wall paintings still cling to plaster demons in vivid reds and greens, noble processions, hunting scenes, lovers in moonlit gardens. Their mythology was rich, full of Persian tales, Indian epics, and even their own homegrown legends. This wasn't just a trade network, it was a civilization with dreams. One mural shows the hero Rustam slaying a monstrous beast. Another shows masked dancers and musicians with long-necked lutes. In a world often defined by kings and conquerors, the Sogdians celebrated story, color, voice. And then, like a sandstorm across the plain, came change. The Islamic conquests reached Sogdiana in the 8th century. Resistance was fierce, at first led by figures like Divashtich, whose name echoes through the chronicles like a last roar. But eventually, the region was absorbed into the Umayyad Caliphate. Some cities were destroyed, others adapted. Slowly, the Sogdians converted to Islam. Their Zoroastrian fire temples went dark, their murals were buried, their language faded. Historians still argue whether this was a violent collapse or a gradual blending. The truth, as always, lies in fragments. But the Sogdians didn't vanish. They morphed. For centuries, after Sogdian merchants still operated in China, even serving as cultural advisors and translators at the Tang court. One Sogdian, Anlushan, even led a major rebellion in 8th century China, nearly toppling the dynasty. And today, you still see their fingerprints in the domes of Central Asian architecture, in the manuscripts preserved in Chinese desert caves, in the genetic threads that run through the peoples of the steppe. You crouch by a well long dry and imagine the conversations once shared here about trade, about gods, about home. You picture camels shuffling through the gates, jangling with cargo and stories. The Sogdians didn't raise monuments. They built bridges between worlds. And somehow that's harder to erase. Night has truly fallen now, not just on your journey, but on the story of these civilizations. The stars are thick above you, clearer than you've seen them in years. A black canvas pricked with cold fire. And in this quiet darkness, you begin to slow. But before you let go entirely, we ease gently into the final chapter. One not of a lost city, but of the hush that follows its silence. You sit on the edge of something ancient. Perhaps it's a stone platform in Tiwanaku, or a dune that hides a Garamantian well, or the low weathered ring of Göbekli Tepe lit only by starlight. Wherever it is, you feel the enormity of it all, not in weight, but in stillness. The world has always turned in cycles. Civilizations rise, flourish, fade, and yet their fingerprints remain pressed into architecture, myth, language, even the stories we whisper before sleep. The Indus Valley's perfect grids now buried. The Sogdian letters faded and fragile. The carved snakes of Nabta Playa waiting for a solstice sun. These are not just remnants. They are lullabies in stone and sand. And maybe that's what history truly is, a collective dream. One passed from tongue to tablet, from monument to memory. A soft chorus of vanished voices saying, "We were here. We mattered." You shift your weight slightly, feeling the coolness of the ground. A light breeze brushes your skin, like fingers turning the last page of a long book. The fan hums faintly in your room. The air is still. Everything slows. Let yourself drift now gently, past the humming walls of Corral, past the moonlit fields of Norte Chico, past the glowing pillars of the Minoans and the shadowed alleys of Aksum. Each one has led you here not to an end, but to a pause, a breath, a space for dreaming. Close your eyes. In the silence between empires, there is peace. In the hush after history, there is rest. And in the warm hum of the present, wrapped in blankets of time and stars and story, there is you, safe, still, asleep,